This is Say It Loud. Buckle your seatbelts and get ready to immerse yourself in the complexities of our government. In 3, 2, 1, blast off.
Hello, welcome to the third episode of Say It Loud. Today we're going to be talking about privacy. My name is Maria.
My name is Leica.
My name is Archit.
And my name is Aram. And let's start with, what does privacy mean to you guys? Is there, a reasonable expectation to privacy?
Yeah, so in 1967, in the Supreme Court case Cass v. United States, the court established a two-pronged test of how to determine when a person has privacy. The first part being that the person themselves expects privacy, hence where expectation of privacy came from. And the second part is that society as a whole deems that expectation to be reasonable. If those two prongs are met, then this person has a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Yeah, and I think understanding what is reasonable expectation is important in applying the Fourth Amendment as well, because again the wording is protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and so what will be considered reasonable, making that distinction, I think is the first step towards any jurisprudence regarding that.
But I think an important thing to note is privacy is not enumerated within the Constitution, right? You're saying that privacy comes under the Fourth Amendment, which is true, but if privacy is not enumerated within the Constitution, why does the government need to protect it?
Well, privacy is considered an implied right, which is kind of what they discovered in Griswold v. Connecticut, where privacy comes from the penumbras of a variety of these combinations. The First Amendment has some implications of privacy with the freedom to associate or choose not to associate in this case. The Fourth Amendment has a search and seizure, and the Ninth Amendment of the rights enumerated to people. And as in Griswold v. Connecticut, these penumbras form the implied right of privacy, which is not something that the courts may continue to recognize in the future, especially in the context of Dobbs.
Yeah, and speaking of Dobbs, in 2022, the court essentially used Dobbs to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is protecting a woman's right to an abortion all these years. Under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, they conferred that a person, the Constitution, gave this implied right to privacy in terms of having an abortion or not, and that states couldn't infringe upon that. But then you have Dobbs, which essentially overturns that, and I think this echoes an overall trend to where justices are looking at the more explicit interpretations of the Constitution, in which the main part of the opinion was that there's no explicit protection of privacy or reproductive privacy within the Constitution, and so there was no need for them to protect that as a whole. And so yeah, I think that's where we're going.
So then the question has to be asked if these justices are doing a good job at taking a very explicit approach to the Constitution over what we in general think the Constitution is supposed to evolve and to capture modern day issues. Are these justices doing a good job by just sticking to the bare bones of the Constitution, you guys think? You say no.
No, I disagree. I don't think that justices are doing a good job of kind of viewing the Constitution, where the founders had originally intended the Constitution to be living. They didn't intend it to be stuck still and stuck forever kind of in the 1700s, but by constantly referring to the exact wording of the Constitution and not interpreting it as a living document that's supposed to change with changing times is an incorrect interpretation of the Constitution.
I think I agree with you, Maria. To even bring it back to the Fourth Amendment, there's different for example, cell phones, for example, used to not be protected under the Fourth Amendment, but now with changing times, the courts have recognized that your Fourth Amendment also protects your right for your cell calls not to be tracked by the government. As a result, I do agree with you, Maria, that these justices should not be just living or basing their decisions strictly on the text of the Constitution, but also the times that we are in currently.
Although I agree to a certain extent that justices and the government shouldn't be looking strictly at the Constitution and nothing else, I believe the framers did intend for the Constitution to be the framework for the government even centuries past. You can see that with the difficulty of the amendment process. They wanted this Constitution to be the fundamental framework to provide stability for the United States, whereas you look at countries in Europe where their Constitution is always changing, and that leads to stability and continuancy issues.
Yeah, speaking of cell phones, Arav, I wanted to talk about like an interesting thing that you made me think of, where you said that like the justices and the justice system is evolving and adapting to these new technologies. And one thing that's come under pressure, especially recently, is the third-party doctrine, where when you consent to have your data shared to like a location. Like if you use Google Maps, you consent to have your location shown. Since you've already given permission, the government can then access that data because you've given your permission to a third party. Do you think the third party is a doctrine is a breach of privacy? If so, should we continue to have it?
I don't necessarily think the third-party doctrine is a breach of privacy because, again, you are giving consent for that data to be shared for a third party like Google, for example, when you're using their services. But I also think that we need to consider that, is there any practical alternative to using like a service like Google or like your phone to call someone? And so maybe that's not truly consensual in that like you kind of end up having to use the service and end up having to give that consent. And so maybe it's like an illusion of like.
Yeah, and to like add on to Leica's point, I do believe that the third-party doctrine does violate your right to privacy, and I think if I remember correctly, Justice Marshall said in Smith v. Maryland, where the third-party doctrine like kind of came from, he said that like in his dissent that individuals do have like an inherent right to privacy of their locations, and there is like no really reasonable alternative to like taking phone calls. So there's no reasonable alternative. And individuals have to have their phones, then they're kind of being forced to consent to these third-party websites that their location is being tracked. And I don't think that's like a voluntarily giving up their rights, and as a result, it shouldn't be allowed because they don't have that right to privacy, even though they're being forced to give it up.
Yeah, that's a great point. And another thing about technology that's interesting is that it's specifically under context of the Fourth Amendment is that it has been increasingly used to help police fight crime and things like that with video surveillance, drones, and geofence warrants, which allow police to capture locations of people in a specific area by requesting it from providers like Google. Do you think that this increased use of new technologies is allowed, and how should it be viewed under the Fourth Amendment?
I don't think that there's like anything inherently wrong with the government or the police using these geofences or these new technologies to capture possible suspects. But I think that one current issue that we're facing right now is that police are allowed to submit overbroad warrants and are still getting these warrants. And I think this is related to like the good faith doctrine, which states that if police officers do their best to create a narrowly tailored warrant, even if it may not be narrowly tailored with this new technology, it's still allowed. And this sets dangerous precedent, as US v. Chaudhry 2024 states, as it may it sets dangerous precedent for police officers in the future to submit overbroad warrants and get these warrants. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this new technology, but we do have to be careful with how we are using this technology.
Yeah, and I like to agree with Ara on some points that there's nothing specifically wrong with new technology. In fact, it's a way to aid police to make their investigative work more easy. In United States v. Jones 2012, the court ruled that attaching a GPS tracker to someone's car was not allowed because it did something, the GPS tracker did something that the police cannot do themselves. But we see in further cases when it is something the police can do themselves, like if they can peek over a fence instead choose to use a camera, then the plain view doctrine comes into play, which has always been a thing, but now with the assistance of new technology, it just makes their jobs easier in that sense.
Well, I do think that's true. I think the court has also been like adapting and setting new precedent for new technologies. For example, in Riley v. Jones, with the use of cell phones, the Supreme Court recognized that the nature of cell phones were more private in the sense that you would need a warrant to access information on a cell phone, as you would to go into someone's house. And so they recognized that there was this distinction for like personal property like cell phones. And so I think with like growing technologies, the court has also, I think it's important that we like set new precedents so that people's rights aren't like threatened.
What about, do you guys think about like facial recognition technology? That's become like very popular over these last few years, and the police are starting to kind of think about using them or are already starting to use them, such as in China, for example. So do you think that this is a breach of the Fourth Amendment?
I think that for facial recognition technology, we can fall back to the old framework we have in CATS. In certain areas, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as in public spaces. And for example, I've known they started to use facial recognition technology at the airport, where the expectation of privacy is already being breached by TSA and things like that. So your expectation of privacy in those areas are low. But obviously using the technology in your own home, secretly being spied on with facial recognition technology, is not a valid use of it. So as long as we fall back to old framework and consider the subjective expectations of privacy, I think new technology can be carefully used.
I agree with Maria. I think especially as you have like AI and like emerging technologies that can, it's not just simply like recognizing your face or taking a picture of it in a public space. It could be used to like reveal more like intimate details about like your personal life that you do have a reasonable expectation of privacy towards. So I think that like allowing such technologies can like, we can't necessarily regulate like how people are going to use these technologies. So like my personal, like I would feel like to be very cautious when extending the Fourth Amendment to them.
Yeah, although I do agree that we don't really have a reasonable expectation of privacy when we're out in public or we're like in airports, for example, I do believe that there is some expectation, at least for me, in my opinion, that like I'm not being tracked. And like I feel like this facial recognition technology can become like a like warrantless surveillance system, which I don't know if in my opinion, I don't think that I'm really like allowing that to happen when I just step outside my house, for example.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about the problems that kind of like data and the problems that data can cause for privacy. Are there any regulations that you've seen concerning data privacy or would like to see in the future to regulate this aspect?
I think we can look towards Europe with their GDPR, I believe, their General Data Protection Regulation, something along those lines. And that provides consumers with a lot of control over the data that they voluntarily, in air quotes, give up to these third-party companies like Google, and they can delete data very easily compared to the United States, and they can basically control the data that they give up. And I believe that the United States should implement something similar to GDPR and their right to be forgotten as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with Archit, and more specifically, like on his last point of the right to be forgotten. This is kind of a new and innovative idea that pops up because of the advent of data privacy, where the right to be forgotten essentially means that people can reach out to Google, submit complaints to Google and providers like these to have their information taken off the internet. And I think this is especially important as we consider like more and more things are being posted on the internet. Your photo may be posted without your consent and things like that. And it's important that if you want to lead a private life to be able to control these things.
But doesn't that like raise concerns about like individuals taking off whatever they want from the internet? Like for example, I myself would not be very comfortable if like a politician who says something really dumb in the past emails Google and decides, oh hey, take this off so I have a good image of me. And also to add on to that, like why should we trust Google to do that job itself? Why do we trust a third-party website or a third-party company to do that? I don't know if like, I do believe that there should be some right to be forgotten, but I think it's a very slippery slope.
Yeah, definitely. And in Europe already, they kind of established that if you have significant like societal or political or like journalistic value, that some things can't be taken down. If you're a politician that's, like said something stupid, that can't be taken down. If you're a journalist that published an article about a politician and the politician doesn't like it, they can't just request for that to be taken down. I think having these safeguards in place is especially important as well. And to address like your second point, Arav, about Google doing it, like sometimes it's just not feasible for the government to do that. It would place too much of a burden on the government, like financially and structurally, to do it when like the best option in this case is Google. But that doesn't mean that the government shouldn't set up systems in the future.
Alright, moving on, do you guys think there are any like situations or places where this right can be curtailed or not as like protected?
Yeah, well, the Fourth Amendment's search and seizure protections are curtailed in places such as schools and car frisking, where the bar isn't the bar is reasonable suspicion, because they believe that, for example, in schools, the authority figures of these principals or whatever, they don't need probable cause. They only need reasonable suspicion. You saw this in the case of New Jersey v. TLO, where a school official found drugs in a student's backpack, but this was just based on an anonymous tip, which would not meet the general probable cause, but they said that the court ruled that you only needed reasonable suspicion.
But do you think like an anonymous tip even amounts to reasonable suspicion? For example, if I tip like the school that, oh my god, Archie has a gun in his backpack, it's not really reasonable suspicion. I could just making up anything I want. I don't know if that's like, yeah, it might be considered a suspicion, but I don't know if it's a reasonable suspicion if I just do that.
Well, I think that the nature of schools makes it inherently different, right? Like you're at an area with a bunch of like kids, and they're trying to learn, and the bar for safety is going to be like much higher at a school than just in like your general private life. Where like if like anonymous tip, like the chance that Archie like has a gun, even if he doesn't, is like far outweighs like his expectation of privacy in the school setting.
But that doesn't really answer the question. Like, are you saying that schools should then instead have something lower than reasonable suspicion?
Well, I say that it does meet reasonable suspicion.
Yeah.
Like the anonymous tip, they can like reasonably suspect that Archit has a gun.
I think like the idea of reasonable suspicion is like a case by case basis, in the sense that I don't think there's any objective standard of what is like a reasonable suspicion. What is considered like meeting that bar, I think at schools will be different than like out in public. So I think, yes, like I agree with Maria in that because of the nature of schools, a reasonable suspicion, like for example anonymous tip, would be like, that would be considered reasonable suspicion compared to like in the public.
I think it also has to be coupled with things such as like the context of the situation, such as the immediate danger. Whereas drugs, for example, doesn't pose as much of an immediate danger. Like if there's a bomb threat, then just the anonymous tip, it is worth checking it for a backpack for a bomb, for example. And also, if there's an anonymous tip, they could maybe like investigate or ask other people, and that would be the reasonable suspicion, not for the warrant to search the backpack, but to do like preliminary investigation.
Yeah, I agree with Archie. I think like that's the key. Like, yeah, if there's like a gun or like something that poses an immediate danger to students, then maybe like school officials do have the right to confiscate it. But I don't think like an individual, like someone giving an anonymous tip that an individual has drugs in their backpack should amount to them seizing the backpack. It can allow them to open an investigation where they can then get reasonable suspicion, but I don't think that they should just be able to seize the backpack. And also to go back to like Leica's point, I think it's like dangerous actually if we just had like different places have different standards of reasonable suspicion. I think that there should be like one objective standard of reasonable suspicion across the nation, and that's my opinion.
But what's the objective standard for probable cause then?
Right, but the point is not that there's not an objective standard, but there's a standard that's like kind of consistent in that way. So like, there's probable cause on school campus should be the same probable cause off campus.
Like I do understand where you're coming from, but I think like again, like when you're issuing like a warrant, like the details and the facts of like are going to be different, like so it's always going to be case by case. And, like I do understand like the important for like consistency to ensure that like you're not acting on something with like no reasonable suspicion, because that could be dangerous. But I do think like keeping in mind the context of like the situation is still important.
Yeah, moving on. Another way that the Fourth Amendment has been curtailed is in the context of national security. The biggest example of this we saw was the Patriot Act 2001 following the September 11 attacks. And this allowed the government to conduct mass surveillance and collect information on citizens without warrants and increase border and airport security.
Yeah, and another place where like your Fourth Amendment rights aren't as protected, that we don't really think about as much, is at the border of the United States as well. The border search exception basically states that at the border, the Fourth Amendment interests of the government outweigh that of like a person like trying to cross the border, like their expectation of privacy. And so in that, it's like you do not need like probable cause. You don't need probable cause to search, just like reasonable suspicion.
Yeah, and I think this calls into question like the constant balance that you have with the Fourth Amendment and your expectation of privacy with the other interests of the people. Obviously, national security is an interest of government aiming to protect the citizens, but oftentimes, for example, with the Patriot Act, that comes at the expense of your own personal liberty. And I think keeping this in mind and constantly balancing the Fourth Amendment, our privacy, and the safety of the people around us is an important idea to keep in mind.
But like, I think it's often like very difficult to. Okay, like what are you guys' opinions on the Patriot Act? Do you think it was overbroad or it was like curtailed enough?
I think the Patriot Act and the immediate implementation post 9/11 was an acceptable reaction to 9/11, considering that like the U.S. before that had no sort of like security infrastructure at airports, no form of digital surveillance and things like that. But now it's almost like over 20 years later, the implementation of the Patriot Act is no longer needed. It should be scaled back, especially the threats that we face now are no longer like as immediate as the threats we faced back then.
But I guess like that brings into question like the emergency powers of like the government. You're saying like it was okay after 9/11 because of quote unquote emergency powers that the government has after such an attack, but I think like that shouldn't really affect the constitutionality of it in itself, because I still believe that the Patriot Act was overbroad even from its conception after 9/11.
I think like I kind of agree with Maria in that like that situation called for such an action, and like we have like historical precedents like even going back to like Lincoln of like infringing on people's rights like at that situation, for example like the Civil War. So while I don't necessarily condone it, I would say it's understandable, provided that there's no like it doesn't have any long lasting like impacts on like someone's like privacy, for example. But like one thing that Maria did say is about like that threat was like no longer true today, but like we don't necessarily know that, right? Like will we want something like 9/11 to happen again for us to for us to take such actions again, or like do we want to infringe on people's like privacies for the benefit of like having like preventative measures, if that makes sense?
Well, no, I don't think that we should continue Patriot Act to prevent things, because that leads down like kind of more of like a slippery slope. At what point do we stop trying to prevent things? Like, are we supposed to go into a totalitarian regime and like complete isolationism so nothing ever happens? So I think going down that path is not reasonable, and so we should just constantly be like looking to the future and attempting to adapt.
I kind of disagree though. I believe that there is like the government does have a responsibility to protect the security of its citizens, and that means that it's not just supposed to be acting after attacks occur, but to also be preventing future attacks. So I do believe that there is some responsibility that the government has to do preventative measures to stop attacks such as 9/11.
Okay, so and on that note, this concludes our episode about privacy, especially focusing on the Fourth Amendment. Clearly the Fourth Amendment is tricky because there are so many different situations and cases in where it can be applied differently, but at the core of it is this need to protect people's privacy. And so I hope this discussion was enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. That was Say It Loud with Arav, Maria, Leka, Arkith, and Danush.